Welcome to the Big and Tall Sports Podcast with your hosts, Pete Apostolopoulos and Alec, Reid.
My generation is zero. I never made it as a working class hero.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. My name's Alec Reid, joined as always by Pete Apostolopoulos. And we have a very special guest here today. Calling in from Minnesota, we have Dave Randorf. Dave, how are you today?
I'm great, boys. Yes, I am calling in from the state of hockey, Minnesota. Great hockey state here, and the Wild are playing the Winnipeg Jets on Wednesday Night Hockey tomorrow night.
Is it snowing there like it is here?
No, but it's cold and wet, and there was snow here earlier, and I'm sure that snow will be coming soon.
So, Dave, we haven't talked in a while. How are the boys doing? I'm sure Kyle's getting close. He's got to be off the way to school soon, right?
Yes, Alec, our families know each other fairly well, and you know that I've got three boys. My oldest son is 19, goes to Niagara College, taking business, and my younger sons, I've got twins, Blake and Trevor. They're 15, and they're playing baseball in the summer and hockey in the winter and trying to get some good marks in between.
So like you said, 20 games into the season, we're only about a quarter way through. A lot of interesting storylines starting to develop. Teams like the Oilers coming up and making a big run at it. And is there a team or maybe a few players in particular that have been your biggest, we'll call them positive surprises, and we'll get into the other side a little later, but the biggest kind of positive surprise for you so far in this season?
Well, I think you have to look at the Edmonton Oilers, what you mentioned right off the bat. I mean, they're top spot in the Pacific Division. They beat Chicago last night. They've beaten some big teams. You know, they manhandled Chicago, smoked them. They've beaten Washington. They've beaten St. Louis. They've beaten some big teams. And they have also been able to get it back on track. They had about a 5-game losing streak, I believe, where, you know, a lot of people in Edmonton or a lot of people looking in on that team could have thought, okay, here we go. You know, that quick start, it's going to dissipate. We've seen this nosedive before. But they were able to pull out of it. And I think this is in large part to do with the real change of mindset and culture within that room, from the coach, Todd McClellan, on down. Actually, from the general manager, Pete Chiarelli, on down. They have really worked on changing that mindset and not allowing a 2 or 3 game losing streak really snowball in a big mess. And they haven't. They've been able to rebound and come back with some quality wins and stay atop that division. You know, they got 23 points in their first 20 games, 11 wins, and you cannot take those points away. I mean, they are there. So the old rule of thumb is, if you are in a playoff position by the U.S. Thanksgiving, which is this weekend, Thursday, you stand a very good chance of making the playoffs. And the Edmonton Oilers are not only in a playoff position, they're in a top 3 seed right now because they lead their division, and they're pushing for a number 2 seed in the West, which is, you know, a big jump up for this Oilers team. I still think that there will be a few more peaks and valleys, but these are big points they're picking up, and they've gotten some help on defense. Cam Talbot has really emerged as a guy who appears to be able to handle that number 1 workload between the pipes. And then, of course, you know, Connor McDavid is one of the top scorers in the league, but he's getting some help, too. He's getting some help from some big bodies, and Zach Cass and Patrick Maroon and Milan Lucic, big guys who bring a mean, nasty kind of winning competitive attitude when you go in to face Los Angeles and the San Jose Sharks and the Chicago Blackhawks. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens in Edmonton down the stretch, and it would be very excited to see them back in the playoffs.
Do you think on the other side of that coin, there's a lot of teams that we maybe expected to be doing a little better, teams like Colorado, Nashville, the Calgary Flames to a certain extent with all the young talent they have, Detroit Red Wings, who we've seen in the playoffs every year since I've been alive, Buffalo Sabres with all the injuries happening. Who are some of the teams and players that you've been a little disappointed with coming out of the first 20 games?
There's no question about it. There's one huge one for me, and that's the New York Islanders. They're dead last in the Eastern Conference, and I think in the league, are they right down there? There must be 29th or no. I'm looking at the standings right now. They're last because they've got 5 wins. This is a team that took a big step last season and got into the playoffs and finally won a round. They had not won a round in the playoffs since 1993, I believe it was. It was I called that game when they won it. It was electric in there in Brooklyn. It was a double overtime winner by, of course, their captain, John Tavares. And it looked like, even though they lost the next round, to a very good Tampa Bay team, it looked like they had taken a step. And it looked like, and they did that without Yaroslav Halak in net. He was hurt for that stretch. So they get him back. He has an excellent World Cup of hockey, and looks like they're poised to build on things. But in the end, they've lost some key players, and they've replaced them with others, and those moves have not worked out yet. Kyle Opozo was maybe not a super flashy guy, but he was a steady 20 to 25 goal guy that you could depend upon when he was healthy, and he's gone to Buffalo. They also got rid of Franz Nielsen, they didn't get rid of him, but they didn't re-sign him. He left as a free agent. And Franz Nielsen, to me, is one of those real underrated guys in the NHL that kills penalties. He can win face-offs. He can do all the little things. And he's been a very dependable Islander for 10 years. And he's moved down the road, too. And so they bring in Andrew Ladd that doesn't work out. Travis Hamonic gets hurt. I mean, it's just been one thing after the next. And it looks like, with 5 wins at this point in the season, that is by far the biggest disappointment in the NHL.
Yeah, definitely. Going back to the Edmonton Oilers and the other Canadian teams, do you think that, aside from Edmonton, who's kind of surprised a lot of people in a way, do you think all the other Canadian teams are kind of right where you expected them to be?
No, you mentioned, in your previous question, the Calgary Flames. And I would put them down as a disappointment. When I looked at all the Canadian teams, of course, each and every one of them missed the playoffs last year. I thought Calgary would be okay. I liked what they did with their goaltending situation. They brought in an experienced guy in Brian Elliott, and then they brought in an experienced backup in Chad Johnson. And now look what they got. Now Johnson's the starter right now, while Elliott is struggling. And that's unfortunate for him because it looked like he was really ready to, with all of his years in the league, was ready to finally get that number one role and run with it. After they had a decent little playoff run with St. Louis and they beat the Chicago Blackhawks. That hasn't happened. And, of course, Johnny Gaudreau got off to a very slow start because he missed all of camp with his contract situation. And now he's hurt and he's out until the new year. So that's a disaster. And then Sean Monahan has not been able to produce at the rate that he has. I mean, this guy's been pretty dependable in his first couple of years, but he's off to a slow start. There's just a whole bunch of different things going on. They're scratching and clawing. I've watched them a little bit of late, but they've dug themselves a hole, and they're on the outside looking in. So Calgary has been a disappointment. Montreal is, they've been so good. Did I think they were going to be this good? Their record is pretty ridiculous, but in large part that's Carey Price, and that's what he can do. But I did think they were going to be where they are for sure, amongst the top teams in the East and in the league. Ottawa's, I guess, somewhat of a surprise because they've been able to tread water without scoring a lot of goals. They are really struggling to score goals. Their goals for and against, they're a minus in that category. Yet they're hanging around too. They're right outside the bubble right now, going into that Thanksgiving Day U.S. weekend. But they've gotten good goaltending from Craig Anderson, and they've got a lot of heart. And they've been really working extremely hard under their new head coach, Guy Boucher, trying to tighten things up defensively. So they're going to be interesting to watch. They've had some injuries of late with Mike Hoffman and Bobby Ryan, but both are expected back very soon. So Ottawa is going to be interesting to watch. They're not a bad team at all.
So we're chatting with Dave Randorf, former Ryerson University graduate. Am I correct?
That's right. I took radio and television arts.
Oh, that's what RTA. That's what we're in right now.
And 1988 was when I graduated.
Well, they broke it up now. We're in the sport media division of RTA. But Dave, after you went through to Ryerson, worked with TSN. That's where you and my dad worked together. Did a lot of World Junior games and under 18s up in the middle of nowhere, up in the Yukon, and et cetera, et cetera. But how was the transition? Obviously, you did a lot of football, did the CFL and TSN, and made the transition a few years ago to working with Sportsnet and doing a lot more hockey. How's that transition been like?
It was. It's been exciting to, get the opportunity and the phone call from them after they bought the rights for the National Hockey League in Canada and the rights for Hockey Night in Canada. To get that opportunity, it was going to take something really special for me to leave TSN. TSN had been very, very good to me for 20 plus years, working on Grey Cups, working on World Hockey Championships with your father, over in Europe, and I literally traveled around the globe thanks to TSN. I'm not just saying that. One trip we flew right around the world. So I'm very, very fortunate to have been gotten to a whole bunch of different great events thanks to TSN and worked with a bunch of great people. So it was going to take something very special for me to leave. And that something special is Hockey Night in Canada. So, it showed that such an institution and a tradition in our country, and one that I grew up watching, one that young and old grew up watching, and it's a part of our Saturday nights. And you as a hockey fan, you at one time or another, you watch it. And I know things have changed a little bit. Actually, not a little bit. Things have changed a lot. But I still think that hockey on Saturday night still endures and still draws enough viewers in where it's it's a bit of still an institution, and to be a part of that is tremendous. So it's also kind of nice to just focus on hockey. I love the CFL, I love the Canadian Football League. I still follow it. I'm looking forward to the Grey Cup on Sunday. But to just focus on hockey is a lot of fun too. And all those, you mentioned a lot of different events, levels of hockey that I broadcast while at TSN. I did some NHL and did the Montreal Canadiens regional games for 4 seasons, but I did a lot of lower levels too, like under 17 and Hellas Cups and RBC Cups. And honestly, it was those games that gave me the training that I needed to do this. Compared to those games, the NHL is easy because everybody. The plays are completed. There's a lot less scrambly play. You can see goals happen before they happen because they're pros. The difference being when you're watching under 18 or under 17, there's a lot more mistakes, a lot more scrambly play. So you're forced to kind of be a little bit more patient with your commentating and be able to adjust on the fly. Plus, you have to look up who all these guys are, who are probably never going to be pros, but you have to make it interesting to the viewer. So there's a lot more work involved at those levels. So it was those work habits and all those things that I took from there that helped me get to this stage.
You mentioned Montreal, obviously, for 4 years there, and done a lot of traveling. I know we went over to Switzerland together and there's the World Juniors, the World Championships, I believe. I think it was the World Hockey Championships over there.
That was the men's World Hockey Championship.
Yeah, and we did that, and I mean, you've been to a lot of different places, obviously, covering these events. Is there a particular place that stands out for you that is kind of your favorite place to commentate in, or your favorite team to commentate for? Is there a certain one that stands out for you?
You mean internationally or in the NHL?
Any, of all the commentating you've done, what was your favorite place to go to do a game or to do an event?
Oh boy, honestly, the list is endless. I mean, the NHL is the NHL. So you're in great NHL cities and great arenas and big crowds and especially in the playoffs, it's a lot of fun. I was very fortunate to do the series when the Winnipeg Jets got back into the playoffs a couple of years ago. And they lost the first 2 in Anaheim, and then they came home to Winnipeg. And that Game 3, with the return of the playoffs, the Stanley Cup playoffs to Winnipeg, was amazing. It was a Monday night.
Sea of white.
Oh my God! It was a Monday night, and that rink, which is loud and full on any given night, it was full for the pregame warm-up, about 45 minutes before the puck drop. That never happened anywhere, ever. And I'm not exaggerating. It was full. It was like the middle of the game. I took pictures and I just, I was working with Gary Galley, and I'd asked him if he'd ever seen anything like that. And he played 17 years in the NHL like your father did. And he says, no, I've never seen anything like this. So that was electric, and that memory will be certainly in my top 3 or 4 nights of working in the NHL. And it's great, obviously, going to places like Montreal and doing games in Toronto or underrated places like, Madison Square Garden. I was fortunate to do a Game 7 in there, and that was very, very exciting. But I'll say this: my European hockey experience was fabulous as well. I really miss it because it's totally different than going to a game in North America. The crowd it's like a European soccer crowd. They sing, and a lot of times they stand the entire game. They bring flags and drums. They beat the drums and they bounce up and down the stands. And it's a different atmosphere than it is for some NHL game.
Like that Hungarian crowd, was it, when we went over to Switzerland and they chanted the whole game?
Example.
They lost 7-1, and I don't think they sat down and they waited for the Hungarian team to come out after and do a curtain call. It was against Team Canada. It was a 7-1 loss, and they chanted until Team Hungary came back out.
Because they were just so happy to be there. They were so thrilled that their team, if I'm not mistaken, they were in the top group of the Men's World Championship for the first time in like 70 years.
Yeah.
I think that was the story. So here they are. They get in, and of course they're not going to win or anything, but they've already won by just getting there to face these top hockey countries, including Canada. And you're right. I remember that's another great memory. That was in Zurich. That game was in Zurich, Switzerland, and the Hungarian fans. That was a classic European hockey moment that you just do not see here in North America. And there's been plenty of those like that. I went to an under-18 in Germany in this little place called, we stayed in a city called Dresden, which was in the former East Germany. And that city was full of history, and then they played the final in this little tiny town called Krimitschau, and the rink, one end of it was entirely open, the outside to the mountains and the hillside, so it was freezing in there. Even though it was late April, it was quite cold, and Canada played Germany in a quarterfinal that was absolutely wild, back and forth, crazy. It was really good, and the crowd there was. I did that game with Mike Johnson. And I remember speaking that tournament is always attended by general managers and assistant GMs in the NHL. And I remember Brian Burke was there and a bunch of other guys, and we were talking to them in the intermission. And they were blown away by the atmosphere. So you never know. Yeah, I mean, I would never even go to this town and see a hockey game like that had it not been for all these great experiences. And it was great. And that tournament, by the way, I believe was won, if I'm not mistaken. I think Russia won it, and Nail Yakupov was on that team. So, it's always fun to go back and look at the rosters of those tournaments, too.
Definitely. Dave, we're going to wrap it up here on the first half of the show. Thank you very, very much for joining us. We had an absolute blast with you. Hopefully we can talk to you again soon, sometime in the new year.
Anytime. Give me a ring, and it's a pleasure to come on at Ryerson. And you guys have no idea how lucky you are. I mean, we all wanted to get into sports broadcasting back then, a lot of us, and there was no sports media course back then. So enjoy it and take advantage, and it's a lot of fun. So thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Dave. We're just going to stay on the line as we go into the break. You're listening to the Big and Tall Sports Podcast with Alec, Reid, and Pete Apostolopoulos.
With your arms up in the sky, like you want to testify for the life that's been deleted. Scream like a rebel's lullaby under the stars and stripes for the lost souls that were cheated. We will be seen but not be heard. Revolution Radio, Operation No Control on the headline. Violence bulletproof. Give me cherry bombs and gasoline. Give your toxic surgery in the headline. Legalize.
And welcome back to part 2 of the Big and Tall Sports Podcast, episode number 4. This week we have Bobby Orr, the great Boston Bruins defenseman, one of Alec's favorite players.
Orre for the Bruins, tied up by Ecclestone and Berenson. Westfall rolled it in front. Sanderson tried a shot that was wide, and Keenan cleared it but not out. Bobby Orr behind the net to Sanderson. Orr! Bobby Orr scores for the Boston Bruins. Have won the Stanley Cup.
I mean, it's pretty simple. I'm a Boston fan. If you're a Boston fan, you like Bobby Orr. It's not that hard.
Definitely. And if he played a little bit longer, he definitely would have cemented himself in that conversation with Gretzky. Obviously, he's there now, but I think that if you add on another few more years of dominance, I think there's no question that he's far and away the best defenseman instead of having the argument that there is now. So we just talked with Dave Randorf about some hockey. Really great having Dave on the podcast. Gave us a lot of good stories, a lot of good insight. Continuing into the NHL, to give a little more of our own opinions here, I really want to go back to what we talked about earlier on in the interview with Dave about the rookies in the league right now, because a lot of people are focusing on the Patrick Laine's and the Austin Matthews and those high-profile offensive guys. But really, we've seen a handful of really solid young defensemen making a lot of big plays for really important teams. We talked about Zach Rowensky with Columbus. He's second in the league in points for defensemen. And I just think that there's a lot of these defensemen who are coming up, and I don't think they're getting as much recognition as they deserve. And we talked about it with Dave. But I think that moving forward, if you see guys like Werenski and Ivan Provorov in Philadelphia and Brady Krage, how do you say that guy's name? Krage. The defenseman for the Rangers. I think that there's a lot of interesting conversation for, rookie of the year. And I know we're only 20 games in, but you got to think that these guys are going to give guys like Laine and Matthews and Mitch Marner a run for their money.
The problem with, the names that you mentioned and maybe why they're not getting as much recognition is because they play in Columbus, Philadelphia, and New York, and we live in Canada. You look at the guys that are tearing it up that everyone's talking about, Patrick Laine, Austin Matthews, Winnipeg and Toronto are two pretty big hockey markets, especially where we are and the news that we see. But you're absolutely right. These three guys are tearing it up right now on both sides of the ice, and that's just what it comes down to. We haven't seen maybe like a PK Subban style that can really do this. And it's just unfortunate that, one, they're defensemen, and two, Columbus isn't exactly a big hockey market when we're talking about up here in Canada, which is sad. I think that these guys do need a lot more recognition, the way that they're playing and moving forward, the way that they will play and will continue to grow. But for the time being, they're not going to get the same kind of respect that Matthews and Patrick Laine get because they're just not in that big of a hockey market, with obviously the exception of the New York Rangers.
Yeah, totally. And if you take into the markets, again, if you go down the list of the top scoring rookie defensemen right now, Werenski is in Columbus, Shea is in New York. Obviously, they're in first place and they're a really strong team. But most of his ice is coming on the power play, so he's not really getting a lot of 5-on-5 time like the other guys at the top of this list are. If you look at Provorov in Philadelphia and Matheson in Florida, two markets. Philadelphia is a pretty good market, but they're not a very strong team, and Florida is not a very good market, and they're a pretty good team, but they're not really doing as well as they did last year. And then if you keep going, and then you have Nikita Zaitsev with the Leafs, obviously, who's playing a lot of minutes and who's playing really well, and he's paired up with Morgan Rielly for the most part. But, that's five guys right there who are all having big impacts. And going back to your point about the markets, I think that that's definitely something that gets overlooked a lot because we are in Canada and because hockey is the sport that we get the most coverage of. Guys can fall through the cracks. And even if you look at a player like Patrick Eaves right now, Patrick Eaves for the Dallas Stars has, I believe, 19 points, 20 points in 21 games or something like that. So there's a lot of things going on right now that outside of Canada that are going on that don't necessarily get as much coverage as they should. And it's it's a blessing and a curse because you want year-round hockey coverage, but you're sometimes going to miss guys.
Something that Dave really talked about that I want to touch on is we mentioned all these young players and these young teams, but how disappointing have, Dave mentioned it, the New York Islanders been? We're talking about these rookies and these guys that are these big-name players, and New York was a team 3-4 years ago that we were talking about with all these players. And he mentioned it, really successful last year in the postseason and obviously winning a round and everything like that. but 5 wins so far. We're almost a quarter of the way through the season. Pete, what is, in your opinion, what is wrong with the New York Islanders?
Well, their big free agent acquisition, Andrew Ladd, has done next to nothing. John DeFerris hasn't been great. Their goaltending hasn't really been great. Yaroslav Halak, who, has shown that he can be a very strong NHL goalie, hasn't played well. And it just looks like, every single night there's something wrong. One night they'll score 2-3 goals, but they'll let in 5. Or the next night, Halak will stand on his head and he'll make a ton of saves and they won't be able to get one in. So I really think it's a combination of things. And then when you count in that, this was like Dave said, this was a team that took a lot of positive steps last year, and a team that plays in a conference now where, with the way it's set up, where they can't really afford to, sit around 20 games in and have 5 wins, right? And the unfortunate thing is because they're so talented and they have so many guys, like, just going down the list, Tavares, Andrew Ladd, who was a very solid player up until this year. And, he's been in the league for almost 10 years, if not more. And then you have, on the back end, you have guys like veterans like Nick Leddy and Johnny Boychuk, and then, young studs like Travis Hamonic. It's a big surprise. And I think going forward that the way that the NHL is structured now, it's going to be tough for them to get back into this playoff position, especially with teams like the Rangers and Pittsburgh in their division.
And another team, I'm just looking at, the player leaderboard right now, a team in their division, in their conference that is really standing out for me is the Tampa Bay Lightning. And Andrew Vasilevsky is leading the league in save percentage right now. Andre Vasilevsky, can't pronounce his name, is leading the league right now in save percentage. But I don't know if we can consider them a contender anymore after last week with Steven Stamkos going down. Now we know he's going to be out 3 to 4 months, something like that. So can we consider the Tampa Bay Lightning a threat coming out of the East anymore?
I think that if you look at the Tampa Bay Lightning, they're still a very solid team. Nikita Kucherov is top 5 in the league in scoring right now. I believe he's second or third. You have guys like Tyler Johnson, Andre Palat, Alex Killorn. You have some guys up front who can put the puck in the net. Jonathan Drouin. And, on the back end, they have Hedman, they have Anton Strawman, they have some players back there who can, play shutdown roles as well as contribute offensively. And then in the net is probably the most intriguing spot, where you have Ben Bishop, who's regarded as one of the top goalies in the league, and then you have this young kid, Andre Vasilevsky, who's also one of the top goalies in the league. And I think with Steven Stamkos out now for 3 to 4 months, I think this trade deadline is going to be the time where Steve Yzerman's going to have to pick his guy and say, hey, you know what? We have these 2 great trade pieces here. I think that they'll ultimately commit to Vasilevsky, and I think this is the time to trade Ben Bishop if you're going to do it, to bring in some offensive firepower.
Who realistically then would be on the market, if you could take a guess? Who could you justify bringing in for some offensive firepower? Because looking around the league, it's not like there are many teams ready to hand out a top scorer. There aren't many teams, other maybe the Islanders or like the Flames, that are so far out of the playoffs already that they're willing to hand out a player.
Well, John Tavares is a free agent at the end of the year.
But is that realistically a trade, or do we not see the Islanders re-signing him?
I mean, if they decide to keep Ben Bishop and trade Vasilevsky, I think that could become a trade. I mean, the guy's in his late 20s and he's leading the league in save percentage and hasn't gotten a chance to play because he's been behind such a good goaltender. And the Lightning have been so reluctant to move one of them because we saw what happened in Vancouver with Corey Schneider and Roberto Luongo, where Vancouver decided to trade Schneider for Bo Horvat, and Corey Schneider's been an absolute star for the New Jersey Devils since they traded him, and Roberto Luongo didn't really work out and ended up getting moved to Florida. So I think that that's probably creeping into the mind of the Tampa Bay Lightning, and also the fact that if you keep letting them play, they're hoping that someone will just outplay the other guy and play themselves, and everything will work itself out. So I think it'll be really interesting looking at them, especially without Steven Stamkos. I think we saw them in the playoffs last year go as far as they did without him, and I think it'll be a difficult ride for them this year, but I think it's definitely doable.
I find it hard to imagine that they can replace over a point a game player so far, 20 points in 17 games, for a long stretch of time. I get it in the playoffs. Last year, went a few rounds without him, but a guy who's consistently is your leader, he's arguably the best goal scorer in the league, the best pure goal scorer in the league, currently sitting 6th in the league in scoring with 20 points. And I find that hard to replace in the long run. Yeah, everyone can step up, we can rally around him. But if you've ever been on a team that loses your best player, you can only rally for so long. Eventually that loss is going to weigh on you and is going to ultimately drag your team down, which is unfortunate. And I'm hoping that Tampa Bay can find a way to come through this, and maybe by trading Kucherov or Ben Bishop, or not Kucherov, but the Vasilevsky. Sorry, I got Kucherov on the brain because he's a guy who needs to step up. With 23 points so far, he needs to continue this trend because Tampa Bay needs now somebody that can replace Steven Stamkos's point outage.
I think if you also look too, the Montreal Canadiens have been absolutely dominating thus far, and with the two teams in the same division, again, it's going to be really difficult without Steven Stamkos. They're going to have to put the puck in the net and continue to keep up with the Montreal Canadiens, because as long as those guys have Carey Price in net, there's no telling how many games they could win, because he's that good and he could steal so many games for that team. And you add a guy like Radulov in there, and they took a flyer on him, and he's worked out really nicely. Alex Galchenyuk has been absolutely great this year. He's 5th in the league in scoring. So I think that with Tampa Bay, they also have to be concerned with the teams around them, because, again, Ottawa is a couple points behind them, and I know we're only 20 games in, but Ottawa is only a couple points behind them, and they're already 5 points behind Montreal. And I think going forward now for the next few months, they're going to have to do something offensively, I think. I just don't think you can fill that void with the guys that you have there. And by having those two big goalies in net, I think one of them has to go in order to bring in some more offense.
I'm glad you brought up Montreal. And this is something that has kind of been a big question for Montreal over the past couple of years, is how far can Carey Price take them? And that's kind of the question I want to ask, is how far can Carey Price, if he stays healthy with the team they have, lead the Montreal Canadiens? Are we ready to say, like a Ken Dryden taking the Canadiens to the Stanley Cup and winning the Stanley Cup, or like a Patrick Waugh did back when he won the Vezina Trophy? Are we ready to, put all our money in on the Canadiens and say, with Carey Price and with this team they have, this is going to be their year? Because as good as they've looked, I mean, without Carey Price, that one game they lost 10-0 a few weeks ago to Columbus. Now, obviously 10-0 isn't a great measuring stick. It's not very reflective of an overall team. However, you look at the other teams coming out of the East. You have New York, you got Pittsburgh, Tampa Bay's right on their heels still, Ottawa. You have all these great teams coming out of the East. And in a 7-game series, I don't know if Carey Price can steal 4 of those games, because he's stolen a lot for them so far this year. I don't know if he can steal 4 games consistently in 4 rounds.
I think it also comes down to 2. Right now, Montreal's sitting 3rd in the league in goals for. They have 63 goals for. They're actually tied for 2nd with Philadelphia. But in goals against, Carey Price and the other netminders, I believe Al Montoya was the one who played in that 10-0 game, and Mike Condon. They've given up 45 goals, which is 6th in the league, and that's counting one game where they gave up 10, and Carey Price didn't give those up. So if you take that off, they're 1st in the league in goals against. And I really think at the end of the day, goaltending and defense is what wins championships. And I think if the offense can continue, they're not going to stay on this crazy pace where they're going to be in the top 5 teams in scoring, because I just don't think that they're built that way. I think that Galchenyuk and Radulov and even Thomas Plekanec a little bit, and then you have Shea Weber and Andrei Markov on the back end. They have some guys who can contribute offensively, but I just don't think that third in the league in goals for is going to be sustainable for this team. But I really do think that when push comes to shove, Carey Price and the way that the team plays defense is going to dictate how successful their season is.
So I want to cue the music up here because we've gone on talking about Montreal, and as a Boston fan, I'm sick of it. So we're going to cue up the music, and I want to start off with some Pete's tweets, my favorite part of the show. And as always, Pete, with your Monday or your Tuesday morning on the way to class, Pete starts out Tuesday morning shuffle with an extremely valiant effort to get me fired up today, but I'm having absolutely none of it. Hashtag Pete's tweets with Stacy's Mom by Fountains of Wayne. Pete, you just weren't feeling it yesterday, were you?
Yeah, yesterday was a huge grind. As I mentioned last week, I guess we didn't have our podcast last week because of our technical difficulties, but I went to Washington, D.C. over the weekend, and it was an extremely, extremely fun trip, but unfortunately I did the whole drive on my own coming home, and I was absolutely exhausted, and we got home late Monday night and had the 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning, and you know, as much as I tried to get myself going yesterday, it just wasn't in the cards.
Speaking of trying to get going, Pete tweets out, no question that today is an extra large with 3 sugars day at Tim's. And unfortunately, you didn't even get the extra large finished by the end of the day. Like, what happened?
Yeah, so we were in class and I cranked through the first half of the extra large, and then I was at a level where I thought I could contribute a little bit and get through the day and maybe even learn something. So I didn't even get through the whole extra large, but it was at the time when I woke up, it seemed like it was going to be impossible for me not to have at least 3 of them.
So this one stings a little bit because if you've been following us and the race to class for Pete every Tuesday morning, you'd know that he's always late. But he tweets out, upset alert, it appears I will beat myself at Alec Reid 14 to class today. The betting line on me to win this morning was plus 15. I don't even know that trillion 15 Google. It was a long shot for Pete to win. Hashtag Pete's tweets. Pete, what happened? Did you win?
I would just like to say that I would put this in the Rudy category in that kind of placement of upset stories, because yesterday was probably the worst that I've felt physically and mentally all year getting up for that class, and the fact that I beat you just shows how unbelievable I am.
Were you on time for class? Because I was only like 2-3 minutes late. Were you on time?
On time with a coffee and a bagel.
So then what I want to bring up, and this is a tweet you actually have from last week. I'm going to read it here for you. Might have broken a Greek person world record by showing up somewhere 5 minutes early. Hashtag Pete's tweets. Is that 2 weeks in a row then that you were early? 2
weeks in a row setting the bar higher and higher. This week, obviously, last week of classes going in, so there's no chances that there's no promises that I'm even going to go to class, given that the professor basically said we're not going to do anything. So, that's a little bit up in the air, but if I'm getting up, you bet your ass that I'm going to get in there as early as I can and keep trying to better myself.
Well, the record currently stands at 10-1 in the race to class between Pete and I. You can follow us on Twitter at BigPete44 and at AlecReid14 as we cut the music here. So, Pete, we got another 10 minutes or so to chat here. Anything you want to talk about in particular? We need a serious topic here. What's going on?
Well, we can talk a little bit of Major League Baseball bargaining agreement, which is slowly starting to grind my gears. And we could talk, a little bit about the NFL, because there's a really, really intriguing week coming up with all the Thanksgiving games on Thursday, and then, we're starting to get down to the nitty-gritty. So let's quickly run through some NFL stuff, and then we'll get to the MLB stuff before we get to wrap up. So really what I want to focus on in the NFL is we've seen kind of the teams like the Dallas Cowboys and the New England Patriots and the Oakland Raiders, I guess you could throw into this category, and sneaky New York Giants at 7-3. You know, we're starting to see those teams who are going to be in that upper echelon. But I'm really interested because, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, there are some terrible divisions in football right now. Absolutely terrible divisions. I was at that Washington-Green Bay game on Sunday night, and the Green Bay Packers are not very good at all, and they still have a chance at winning their division. So I guess my question is, you know, if you look at the NFC North, the NFC South, the AFC South, and the AFC North, what are we going to expect from these teams in these divisions? Because right now it just seems like it's wide open in all four of those.
You're going to expect the Houston Texans from last year. They're going to somehow get a home playoff win because it's just a joke that you just win the division and, you know, get to host a playoff game. But I honestly don't know. I think the most interesting race, and for all the wrong reasons, is going to be the AFC South. So you have the Houston Texans, the Indianapolis Colts, and the Tennessee Titans. And we can forget Jacksonville. They're a terrible football team. But you have three interesting stories. Can Houston, with a backup quarterback in Brock Osweiler and no J.J. Watt, hold off the ultimate franchise quarterback with the terrible team in the Indianapolis Colts? And then you have the 45 points per game Tennessee Titans with no defense. I'm interested to see that race, not because I want any of those teams to win, not because I think any of those teams are going to win, but I think that's going to be the most exciting race because there's so many interesting stories coming down the stretch. And I honestly hope that we get one of those, it comes down to the last game of the season type of ones. You know, like we had last year, it was Kansas City needed a win and they could win the division, and then Denver was going to be out, so Denver had to win. We need one of those. And we haven't really had that, you know, win or go home. Remember, like the Eagles and the Giants from when Deshaun Jackson took that punt return back to the house. We need something like that to bring a spark back to the NFL, because the NFL has been a dead league this year. It's pretty much set who's going to be the top four teams already. You got New England, Dallas. I honestly you could pick any one of the AFC West teams right now to be that other one. And then, I mean, who cares who's coming out of the other team in the NFC, because they're not beating Dallas. And that's the point I want to bring up. And I got the coin out here to play a little coin flip. Pete, I think, do you and I both agree that Dallas is going to win the NFC?
Yes, I think that they're the most complete team in the NFC.
So that's why I want to play a little coin flip. So heads, you got to argue against, I don't care what team you pick, but heads, you got to argue that another team is going to win the NFC. Tails, I will. It is tails. So I got to pick.
So wait, I have to defend another team?
No, you're defending Dallas. You're good.
Okay.
So I'm going to pick Seattle. And here's why. When you said Dallas is the most complete team, I think Seattle has the potential to be the most complete team. They have, you know, no offensive line, but I would argue they got the best defense in the NFC. I think it's better than Minnesota's. They have a franchise quarterback. They got two good receivers that are really coming to their own. They got Jimmy Graham. If that O-line can figure some sort of method out, I think they're the best team. And they proved that they can be that team with how they played against the Patriots. And if I'm the New England Patriots, I think I'm more scared of Seattle coming out of the NFC than I am Dallas coming out of the NFC, because Seattle's 90% of those guys have been there. They've played the Patriots. They know what to expect, whereas Dallas is a very young team with Prescott and Ezekiel Elliott. You don't have those leader guys like you know, the Russell Wilsons and the Richard Shermans and the Cam Chancellors that Seattle has. So if it comes down to that game, I kind of like the veteran leadership of Seattle upsetting, if we're going to call it an upset, the upstart rookies of Dallas. I think Dallas is maybe 1 year away. If I'm going to argue for Seattle, I'm just going to say they're 1 year away. But put it on record, I still think Dallas is going to win the NFC.
I think that a lot of what we see in the NFL in the playoffs comes from the defense side of the ball. And like you said, Seattle probably has the best defense in the NFC. But as we've talked about, I think that Dallas has probably the most underrated defense in the NFC. And if you combine that with a guy like Dak Prescott, who plays a similar style and has a similar sort of aura to his game that Russell Wilson has, and if he's getting better and better every week, and then Ezekiel Elliott's a lock for Offensive Rookie of the Year and is probably going to be in the MVP conversation as well. So if you combine that, you've dealt with Tony Romo already. He's already, you've dealt with your quarterback controversy, quote unquote, and he's going to be probably playing in Denver next year. But if you look at this Dallas team, they have a lot of swag and they have a lot of playmakers on offense and a very, very underrated defense. And, a lot of times we've seen in sports where you have to lose before you can win. And I think that might be the case with this team, but it would not shock me one bit if this was the NFC representative in the Super Bowl.
So I'm glad. That was a good argument. I like that. This is a good one. But unfortunately, there's an argument that's going on right now that I hate to talk about because we've seen so many CBAs and issues and lockouts in the past, 20 or so years. But unfortunately for baseball, coming off the hottest season for baseball in a number of years, the most exciting time to watch baseball, we're looking at a lockout if they don't agree by December 1st. And that just, it makes me sad because I loved baseball this year. I've always loved baseball, but baseball was the peak of entertainment for September and October. Baseball was at a high. Everyone wanted to watch baseball, and now we might get a lockout. Pete, what's going on?
Okay, so Ken Rosenthal yesterday wrote an article on foxsports.com, and the headline says, Sources, baseball's 21-year run of labor peace could be in jeopardy. So for those of you who don't understand how this works, or understand how a lockout works, basically, if they don't come to agreement, everything stops. There's going to be no more free agent signings, and that's why we haven't seen a lot of those big guys get signed, because we don't know what's going to happen with the CBA and how contracts are going to be able to be moving forward. But basically, the big issue right now is the players want to get rid of compensation draft picks, because if you see guys like Jose Bautista, if that guy doesn't have a draft pick attached to him, he's probably signed already, right? And he's probably making a lot more money because teams can use that as leverage and be like, well, we don't want to if we have to give up a draft pick, we're probably not going to be able to negotiate the same way you would be able to negotiate with a player who doesn't have that draft pick attached to him, especially older players, guys like Jose Bautista who are in their last contract or their last big contract. Because if Jose Bautista, we've seen how many times in the last few years with guys having draft picks attached to them, they'll sit there. Jose Bautista could sit there till February, right? And the thing that the owners want is an international draft. And international players don't want that because we've seen this this year already. I think there's been 5 contracts over $50 million awarded to non-American or Canadian players, to Latin players. And that would be what the international draft is. I don't know how it would work with Canadian players, but I mean, for baseball, it makes sense because the teams would save a lot of money. But for the players, if you're a 16, 17-year-old phenom like a Vladimir Guerrero Jr., you don't want to get drafted and have to have a certain amount of slot money. You want to sign with whatever team you want by whoever you want. Now, do I think that an international draft would benefit these players in the long run? Absolutely, especially when you read about how these teams in Cuba and Dominican and how these players have to get here and what they do to get here and how influential some of these coaches are, and a lot of times it's in the wrong ways. Absolutely think it could benefit players in the long run, even if they don't see it that way. But this is going to be really interesting because, like you said, baseball is coming off of a very, very strong year. And we're seeing the NFL have a not very good year, and the NBA is doing very well as well. So I think it could be really interesting. And I think if baseball does indeed go through with a lockout, I don't know what could happen because, I mean, we haven't really talked about it a lot this year because the season was so exciting and so interesting. At the end of the day, the product on the field isn't there until April. So if this happens on December 1st, this thing's going to get really interesting.
I think, unfortunately, it kind of kills baseball if we have this lockout. Because you're right, baseball's been so good, it's been so exciting, and it'll just be an unfortunate situation that we have to end all of this excitement and, much like the lockout in 2004 with hockey, just put everything on hold and say, I guess we got to restart. So it's an unfortunate situation.
I think also, too, when you look at the stuff that they're arguing about in baseball, it's not like it's small stuff. There is 5 or 6 big key issues that teams and owners are wanting to take care of, and there's another 5 or 6 issues that the players want to take care of. So they have a lot of work to do and not a lot of time. We're recording this on November 23rd, so they have till December 1st to figure this out. Otherwise, this offseason could be unlike any that you or I have seen in our lifetime.
So here's hoping that they figure it out. I'm really looking forward to baseball next year. Hopefully we have some baseball to watch. Unfortunately, we got to wrap it up here on the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. Big shout out to Dave Randorf for coming in. And just before we go, I just want to say, keep your thoughts and your prayers with Craig Cunningham of the Tucson Roadrunners, who collapsed just this past week on the ice. Is currently in stable but critical condition at the time of this recording. So if you're a religious person, be sure to keep Craig in your prayers for the time being. That's going to do it for us here on the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. We're going to play it out here.